The coldest thing a spouse can do isn't leave. It's stay, look you in the eye, and make you feel like you've already disappeared. My name is Cole Harrison. I'm 42 years old, born and raised in Ohio. And until a year ago, I thought I understood exactly what marriage was supposed to look like. 18 years together, 2 kids, a 4-bedroom house in a quiet subdivision outside Columbus, a black Ford F-150 in the driveway. Saturday mornings spent mowing the lawn. Friday nights ordering takeout from the same Italian place we'd been using for almost a decade. From the outside, our life looked solid, stable. The kind of marriage people assume will last forever because nothing dramatic ever seems to happen. Looking back now, that's probably why I missed the warning signs. Catastrophes don't always arrive with sirens. Sometimes they show up disguised as ordinary evenings. It was a Thursday in late October. The kind of night where the air turns sharp enough to remind you winter is coming. I'd spent most of the day dealing with a supplier issue at work. By the time I got home, all I wanted was dinner, a shower, and maybe 30 quiet minutes on the couch before bed. The house smelled faintly like garlic and roasted vegetables. The television was playing somewhere in the background. Madison stood in the kitchen scrolling through her phone while a half-finished glass of sparkling water sat beside her. For a second, everything looked normal. That's the strange thing about life-changing moments. They never announce themselves. I set my keys on the counter and smiled. "Long day?" I asked. She barely looked up. "Not really." Her voice was flat, casual, the kind of answer that ends a conversation before it starts. I opened the refrigerator and grabbed a bottle of water. The compressor hummed softly behind me. The kitchen lights reflected off the granite countertops we'd spent months saving for 15 years earlier. Every detail felt ordinary, familiar, safe. Then I made a mistake. At least that's what she seemed to think it was. I walked behind her and lightly touched her shoulder. Not dramatically, not romantically, just the kind of small gesture married people make after nearly 2 decades together. Madison froze, slowly lowered her phone, then turned toward me. Her expression wasn't angry. Somehow that made it worse. Anger still contains emotion. This was something colder, something detached, like she was correcting a misunderstanding. "Cole," she said, "stop acting like we're into each other." I blinked. At first I thought I'd misheard her. The refrigerator hummed. A faucet dripped somewhere in the house. Outside, a dog barked in the distance. Everything seemed strangely louder all of a sudden. "What?" I asked quietly. She sighed. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just impatiently, like someone explaining something obvious. Then she said the sentence that would replay in my head for months afterward. "You're basically my roommate." The words landed without warning. No shouting, no argument, no build-up. Just 6 simple words delivered with the emotional weight of discussing the weather forecast. "You're basically my roommate." I wish I could tell you I had some clever response. I didn't. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand an explanation. I didn't ask if she was joking. I just stood there holding a bottle of water while something inside me quietly cracked. Madison looked back at her phone almost immediately. Conversation over. Case closed. As far as she was concerned, she'd simply stated a fact. The silence stretched between us. Heavy. Unnatural. For a moment, I watched the reflection of the kitchen lights in the dark window above the sink. I could see both of us standing there. Husband and wife. Same house. Same room. Same life. Yet somehow farther apart than we'd ever been. Eventually, I nodded once and walked away. Not because I knew what to say, because I didn't. Upstairs, I sat on the edge of the bed we'd shared for nearly 20 years and listened to the house settle around me. The air conditioning clicked on. A floorboard creaked somewhere down the hallway. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary night. Ordinary life. Except it wasn't ordinary anymore. Because once someone tells you how they truly see you, you can't unknow it. And sitting there in the quiet, staring at the family photos lined across the dresser, I realized something that scared me more than her words ever could. I wasn't shocked because Madison had called me a roommate. I was shocked because deep down, a part of me already knew she meant it. What I didn't know yet was that her sentence wasn't the end of our marriage. It was the beginning of a story neither of us saw coming. The strange thing about realization is that it rarely arrives all at once. It comes in pieces. Small memories. Forgotten moments. Tiny details your mind ignored because accepting them would have hurt too much. The morning after Madison called me her roommate, I woke up before sunrise. The bedroom was dark except for the faint blue glow of the alarm clock. 5:23 in the morning. For years, that had been my routine. Wake up, get dressed, make coffee, start the day. Nothing about that morning was different. Yet everything felt different. Madison slept on her side of the bed, facing away from me. The same position she had slept in for months. Maybe years. I stood quietly and walked downstairs. The hardwood floor felt cool beneath my feet. The coffee maker hummed to life. Outside, the neighborhood sat silent beneath a gray Ohio sky. I wrapped both hands around a ceramic mug and stared through the kitchen window. Looking back, the signs had been everywhere. I just kept explaining them away. That is what people do when they love someone. They become experts at creating excuses. I remembered our first apartment after college. 600 square feet above a hardware store. The air conditioner barely worked. The kitchen was so small 2 people could not stand in it comfortably. We used folding chairs for 6 months because we could not afford furniture. Back then, Madison used to laugh at everything. We would stay up until midnight talking about our future. A bigger house, kids, vacations, retirement. The kind of dreams young couples build together when they still believe life moves in a straight line. Then came the years of building. Long hours, overtime shifts, promotions, mortgage payments, school events, soccer practices, parent-teacher conferences. I spent nearly 2 decades chasing stability because I thought stability was another word for love. Every extra hour I worked felt like an investment in our future. Every sacrifice felt worthwhile because it was for us. At least that is what I believed. The coffee had started to cool when another memory surfaced. 10 years earlier, Madison used to wait for me when I got home, no matter how late it was. Sometimes we would sit on the back patio with iced tea and talk about our day. Somewhere along the way, those conversations disappeared. First it became once a week, then once a month, then not at all. I told myself life was busy. The kids were getting older. Careers demanded more attention. Couples go through seasons. That was the phrase everybody used. Seasons. Looking back, I realized some seasons are not temporary. Some are warnings. By 7 o'clock, the house had started waking up. Cabinet doors opened. Water ran in the upstairs bathroom. Footsteps crossed the hallway. Ordinary sounds. Yet for the first time, I noticed something unsettling. Nobody really talked to each other anymore. We operated like co-workers sharing office space. Efficient, polite, detached. Madison came downstairs wearing a navy sweater and carrying her phone. She poured herself coffee without looking up. No good morning. No smile. No mention of what she had said the night before. It was almost as if the conversation had never happened. Maybe for her it had not. Maybe she had been living with that belief for years. I watched her stand at the counter scrolling through messages. The woman I had built a life with felt strangely distant. Not angry, not cruel, just absent. And somehow that hurt more. Because anger means someone still cares enough to feel something. Absence is different. Absence is what happens when somebody checks out long before they leave. The realization settled over me slowly, like cold rain. Madison had not suddenly become a stranger. The distance had been growing for years. I had simply refused to measure it. For 18 years I thought I was protecting our marriage. But sitting there in that quiet kitchen, watching the woman I loved stare into her phone as though I barely existed, I began to wonder if I had been protecting something that was already gone. And for the first time, a question entered my mind that I was not ready to answer. If she truly saw me as nothing more than a roommate, when exactly had she stopped seeing me as her husband? Once a painful truth finds its way into your mind, it starts changing how you see everything around you. During the weeks that followed, I stopped looking at my marriage through the lens of hope and started looking at it through the lens of reality. The difference was unsettling. Suddenly, things I had ignored for years became impossible to miss. Madison was home almost every evening, but she was never really present. She sat on the same end of the couch every night, phone glowing in her hand, scrolling endlessly while the television played to an audience that was not watching. Sometimes I would ask how her day went. Most of the time, I received a one-word answer. Fine. Busy. Normal. Then the conversation would die before it had a chance to breathe. It was not hostility. In some ways that would have been easier. It was indifference. Quiet. Consistent. Unmistakable indifference. One Saturday afternoon, we attended a neighborhood barbecue hosted by friends we had known for nearly 15 years. The smell of burgers drifted through the air. Kids ran across freshly cut lawns. Football played on an outdoor television mounted beneath a covered patio. It was the kind of gathering we used to enjoy together, back when we still felt like a team. I remember standing beside the grill talking with a few neighbors when someone asked Madison how we were doing. It was a simple question, casual conversation, the kind people ask without expecting much of an answer. She smiled politely and said, "Oh, we are doing fine." Then she changed the subject. Nothing unusual about that. Except I noticed something. She did not reach for my hand. She did not look at me. She did not include me in the conversation. I stood 5 feet away and somehow felt invisible. Later that afternoon, another neighbor introduced us to a couple who had recently moved into the subdivision. "This is Madison," he said. Then he pointed toward me. "And this is her husband, Cole." The new couple smiled and shook our hands. Madison smiled too. But as we walked away, a strange realization settled over me. If somebody had not identified me as her husband, nobody there would have known. We looked more like distant acquaintances attending the same event than a married couple of 18 years. Looking back, moments like that had become normal. Madison attended company functions alone whenever possible. If coworkers asked about me, she would mention my name but rarely tell stories about us. Family vacations had become smaller and shorter every year. Date nights disappeared entirely. Even our conversations had become transactional. Bills, schedules, groceries, appointments. We communicated efficiently, but never intimately. One evening I sat at the kitchen table reviewing monthly expenses while Madison stood nearby, packing a bag for a weekend trip with friends. The suitcase sat open on the counter, neatly folded clothes stacked beside it. She looked excited, more excited than I had seen her in months, maybe years. "Sounds like you are looking forward to it," I said. "I am," she answered. "It will be nice to get away for a few days." Then she smiled. A genuine smile. The kind I had not seen directed toward me in a very long time. After she walked upstairs, I remained at the table staring at the numbers in front of me. Not because of the trip, because of the smile. It hit me harder than I expected. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped bringing that version of herself home. The realization followed me for days. At work, during my commute, while mowing the lawn, while lying awake at night listening to the house settle around me. The woman I married was still there. I could see flashes of her when she talked to friends, when she planned trips, when she laughed at something on her phone. But those moments never seemed to belong to us anymore. They belonged to everyone except me. And the more I paid attention, the more one uncomfortable question refused to leave my mind. If Madison still had happiness to give, why was I the only person no longer receiving it? The conversation that changed everything happened on a rainy Wednesday evening. And the strange part is that it almost did not happen at all. I had finished dinner alone because Madison texted that she would be late meeting friends from work. That was becoming increasingly common. The house felt unusually quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the dishwasher hummed in the background. Around 8:30, I realized I had left my tablet charging in the upstairs guest room that Madison sometimes used as a home office. I walked down the hallway without thinking much about it. The door was slightly open. A narrow strip of warm light spilled onto the carpet. As I approached, I heard voices. Madison was on a video call. Normally, I would have announced myself or simply walked away. Instead, something made me pause. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the accumulation of everything that had been bothering me for months. Whatever it was, I stopped. Her voice drifted through the opening. Relaxed, comfortable, different from the voice she used around me. Someone on the call laughed. Then another woman spoke. I recognized the voice immediately. It belonged to one of her closest friends, Danielle. "So how are things with Cole?" Danielle asked. There was a brief pause, a few seconds at most. Then Madison laughed. Not a cruel laugh, not even an angry one. Just the kind of casual laugh people use when discussing something they no longer take seriously. "Honestly," she said, "we are basically roommates at this point." My chest tightened. The hallway suddenly felt smaller. I stood perfectly still. Danielle chuckled. "Then why stay married?" she asked. The question hung in the air. I remember holding my breath. Part of me expected Madison to defend us, to mention the years we spent together, the family we built, the memories, the sacrifices, something, anything. Instead, her answer arrived quickly. Too quickly, like she had already thought about it before. "Because it is easier," she said. Easier. One word. 6 letters. Somehow it hurt more than everything else. Rain tapped against the window. A car drove past outside. Life continued moving exactly as it always had while mine felt frozen in place. Danielle laughed softly. "You know he is never going to leave, right?" she said. More laughter followed. Then Madison responded with a confidence that settled deep into my stomach. "Exactly." There was no hesitation in her voice. No uncertainty. Just certainty. Complete certainty. Cole will always stay. He is predictable. He likes stability too much. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Not because she was talking about divorce. She was not. Not because she was talking about another relationship. She was not. What hurt was realizing how she saw me. Not as a husband. Not as a partner. Not even as a person capable of making choices. I was a constant. Furniture. Infrastructure. Something dependable that would always remain exactly where she left it. The conversation continued, but I barely heard the rest. My thoughts had already started racing. I quietly stepped backward and returned downstairs. The living room felt darker than before. I sat in my recliner and stared at the television without turning it on. Madison's words replayed over and over inside my head. Because it is easier. Cole will always stay. The confidence behind those statements disturbed me more than the statements themselves. They revealed something I had never fully understood. Madison was not worried about losing me. She had not even considered the possibility. Somewhere over the years, she had become completely convinced that no matter how distant she grew, no matter how little effort she invested, no matter how disconnected our marriage became, I would simply continue standing in the same place forever. The realization settled over me slowly. Heavy. Unavoidable. For 18 years, I thought loyalty was strengthening our marriage. But sitting alone in that dark living room, listening to rain strike the windows, another possibility entered my mind. What if my loyalty had taught her that she never had to value me? And for the first time since the night she called me a roommate, I stopped asking what happened to our marriage and started asking a very different question. What would happen if one day I proved her wrong? The next morning, nothing looked different. The sun still rose over the neighborhood. Traffic still crawled along Interstate 270. The coffee maker still gurgled at 5:30 in the morning. But something inside me had changed. For years, almost everything I did revolved around making life easier for Madison. Not because she asked. Because I believed that was what a good husband did. I filled her gas tank when it ran low. I scheduled maintenance appointments for her SUV. I handled household repairs before she even noticed they were needed. If a bill arrived, I paid it. If something broke, I fixed it. If a problem appeared, I solved it. None of it felt like sacrifice at the time. It felt like love. But after hearing her conversation with Danielle, I began looking at those habits differently. One Saturday morning, I stood in the garage holding a replacement air filter for her vehicle. Normally, I would have installed it immediately. Instead, I set the box on a shelf and walked away. It sounds insignificant. Maybe it was. But it was the first time in years that I consciously chose not to solve a problem that was not mine. The following week, Madison mentioned her vehicle needed an oil change. Usually, I would have scheduled the appointment myself. This time, I simply nodded. "You should probably get that taken care of," I said. She looked surprised for a moment, then returned her attention to her phone. A few days later, she asked if I had mailed a package she left near the front door. I had not. The package remained exactly where she left it. "I thought you were taking care of that," she said. "No," I answered calmly. "I figured you were." She stared at me for a second. Not angry, just confused. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet I noticed something important. For the first time, Madison seemed mildly inconvenienced by my absence. Not physically, emotionally, functionally. The strange thing was that I did not feel guilty. I expected guilt. Instead, I felt peaceful, as though I had been carrying a heavy backpack for years without realizing how much it weighed. Over the next several weeks, I made a quiet decision. I would stop chasing, stop fixing, stop anticipating needs that nobody appreciated. If Madison viewed us as roommates, then I would begin treating the relationship exactly that way. Respectful, civil, detached. I did not argue. I did not lecture. I did not bring up the conversation I overheard. I simply stepped back. When she went out with friends, I stopped asking when she would be home. When she sat scrolling through her phone, I stopped trying to start conversations that died after 3 sentences. When she forgot appointments, I allowed her to remember them herself. Life became surprisingly quiet. The silence that once felt painful began feeling comfortable. During that same period, I opened a separate savings account. Nothing dramatic. Nothing secretive, just a practical step. For years, every financial decision centered around our shared future. For the first time, I started considering my own future as well. The idea felt unfamiliar, almost rebellious. One evening I sat on the back patio, watching the sun disappear behind rows of identical suburban rooftops. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and charcoal grills. Somewhere nearby a dog barked. Inside the house, Madison laughed at something on her phone. The sound drifted through the screen door. I listened for a moment, then returned my attention to the sunset. Months earlier, that laughter would have bothered me. I would have wondered why she seemed happier talking to strangers than talking to me. Now I felt something different. Distance. Not bitterness. Not anger. Just distance. The kind that develops when a person stops expecting something they have not received in years. Looking back, that was the moment everything truly began changing. Not because Madison changed. She did not. Not yet. The change happened inside me. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, I stopped organizing my life around the hope that she would eventually choose our marriage again. And without realizing it, I had taken the first step toward a future she was absolutely certain would never happen. Change is strange because most people do not notice it while it is happening. They only recognize it after enough time has passed to see the difference. For me, the shift began with a simple decision. Every morning before work, I started walking. Nothing dramatic. Just 30 minutes around the neighborhood while the rest of the subdivision was still asleep. The air carried that crisp Ohio chill that lingers through spring. Sprinklers clicked in distant yards. Porch lights glowed softly against the darkness. For years, my routine had been work, home, television, sleep, repeat. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped investing in myself. Not because anybody asked me to. Because I convinced myself there would always be time later. Later turned into years. The walks became a habit. The habit became longer walks. Then weekend hikes. Then a gym membership I had been putting off for almost a decade. At first, I felt out of place. The weight room was filled with people younger than me, faster than me, stronger than me. But something surprising happened. Nobody cared. Nobody was judging me. Everybody was simply trying to improve themselves. There was something refreshing about that. For the first time in years, I was doing something that belonged entirely to me. As the weeks passed, I noticed changes. My energy improved. I slept better. My shoulders felt lighter. Even my doctor commented during a routine checkup that my blood pressure looked better than it had in years. Small victories. Quiet victories. The kind nobody celebrates except the person earning them. Around the same time, I started reconnecting with parts of my life I had neglected. Old friends I had not called in years suddenly appeared in my contacts again. One Saturday afternoon, I met my college friend Ryan for lunch. We sat in a sports bar downtown watching baseball highlights while catching up on nearly 15 years of missed conversations. It struck me how much of my world had gradually narrowed. Without realizing it, I had built my entire identity around being a husband and provider. Those roles mattered. They always would. But somewhere in the process, I had forgotten that I was also an individual person. A man with interests, friendships, and goals that existed outside of marriage. The more I focused on rebuilding those parts of my life, the less attention I paid to what Madison was doing. Ironically, that seemed to be when she started noticing. One evening I came home from work carrying a gym bag. Madison was sitting in the living room scrolling through her phone as usual. She glanced up briefly. "You have been going to the gym a lot lately," she said. "Yeah," I replied. "I enjoy it." The conversation ended there. But I noticed something unusual. She watched me walk upstairs. It was only a second, maybe 2. Yet it stood out because for months she barely seemed aware of my presence. A week later, I bought a few new shirts. Nothing expensive, just clothes that actually fit properly after losing some weight. When I wore one to dinner with friends, Madison looked up from her phone. "That is new," she said. "It is," I answered. Again, silence followed. But the observation lingered. The changes continued. Coworkers commented on my energy. Friends invited me to more outings. Life began expanding in directions I had not expected. What surprised me most was how little it had to do with appearance. The real difference was confidence. Not arrogance. Not revenge. Confidence. The quiet confidence that comes from realizing your happiness does not depend entirely on someone else's approval. Then came the moment that made me realize the balance inside our house was beginning to shift. One Friday evening, Madison came home later than usual. I was already heading out the door to meet friends for dinner. She stepped into the kitchen and looked surprised to see me grabbing my keys. "You were going somewhere?" she asked. The question seemed ordinary, but something about her tone felt different, almost uncertain. "Yeah," I said. "A few of us are getting dinner downtown." She paused, just for a second, then nodded. "Oh, okay." I smiled politely and headed toward the door. As I walked outside, I caught a glimpse of her standing in the kitchen window watching me leave. For 18 years, I had been the predictable one, the dependable constant, the man who would always stay exactly where she expected him to be. But standing in that driveway beneath the fading evening sky, I had the distinct feeling that for the first time in a very long time, Madison was no longer completely sure of that. The first real sign appeared at a charity fundraiser in early September. It was one of those events neither of us particularly enjoyed but attended every year out of habit. The ballroom sat inside a downtown Columbus hotel, filled with round tables, soft lighting, and the familiar sound of polite conversations floating through the room. In previous years, Madison usually spent most of the evening talking with coworkers while I stood nearby, making small talk with strangers. The arrangement had become normal, predictable, comfortable in its own detached way. This year felt different, not because of anything I did, because of how Madison reacted. The evening started quietly enough. I wore a navy sport coat and one of the new shirts I had bought a few months earlier. Nothing extraordinary, just clothes that fit properly. We arrived together, checked in, and found our table. For the first hour, everything seemed ordinary. Then I noticed something. People were talking to me more. Coworkers I had met briefly in previous years remembered my name. A couple from another table invited me into a conversation about hiking trails. One of the event organizers asked about a community project I had recently joined. Small interactions, harmless interactions. Yet something about them seemed to catch Madison's attention. More than once I noticed her glance in my direction while speaking with friends. Not angry, not upset, just watchful. Later in the evening, I stepped away from the table to grab a glass of sparkling water. While standing near the refreshment area, I ran into an old acquaintance named Lisa. We had known each other casually through volunteer work for several years. She smiled when she saw me. "Cole, you look great," she said. "You seem happier these days." I laughed softly. "I feel better these days." We talked for a few minutes about work, fitness, and mutual friends. The conversation was completely ordinary. Friendly, respectful, nothing more. Yet when I returned to our table, Madison seemed unusually quiet. The change was subtle. Most people would not have noticed it. I did. Throughout the rest of the evening, she asked several questions she normally would not ask. "Who was that? How do you know her? Have you seen her recently?" The questions were casual, but they stood out because curiosity had been absent from our marriage for a very long time. On the drive home, rain tapped lightly against the windshield. Streetlights reflected across wet pavement. Madison stared out the passenger window for several minutes before finally speaking. "You seem different lately." Her voice was calm, careful. I kept my eyes on the road. "Different how?" She hesitated. "I do not know. Just different." I nodded. The silence returned. A few miles later she spoke again. "You have been spending a lot more time away from home." The statement almost made me smile. Not because it was untrue, because of who was saying it. For years, Madison had filled her schedule with trips, dinners, outings, and weekends away. I had never questioned it. Now that I was building a life beyond the walls of our house, she suddenly seemed aware of time passing. "I guess I have been busy," I said. She looked out the window again. The conversation ended there, but something had changed. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. Madison started noticing things she previously ignored. She asked where I was going, who I was meeting, what I was doing. Nothing accusatory, nothing dramatic, just questions. Questions that would have sounded perfectly normal in most marriages. Yet in ours, they felt unusual because they had disappeared years earlier. One Sunday afternoon, I came back from a hiking trip with friends. The house smelled like fresh coffee. Madison stood in the kitchen. "You seem happy lately," she said. I looked at her for a moment. The observation caught me off guard because it was true. I was happier, not because my marriage had improved. It had not. I was happier because I had finally stopped waiting for someone else to create happiness for me. "I am doing well," I replied. She nodded slowly. For a brief second, something crossed her face. Not anger, not resentment. Something closer to uncertainty. Then it disappeared. Later that night, Lying awake in bed, I stared at the ceiling while the house settled around us. The realization arrived quietly. For years, Madison had been completely confident that I would never change, never leave, never grow beyond the role she assigned me. But confidence becomes fragile when reality stops cooperating. And for the first time since I overheard her conversation with Danielle, I had the unmistakable feeling that Madison was beginning to understand something she never expected to learn. The version of me she thought would stay forever was slowly disappearing. The decision itself took less than 10 minutes. The journey to reach it took nearly 18 years. By late October, the trees around our neighborhood had turned shades of gold and copper. Leaves drifted across driveways. The air carried that familiar Midwestern chill that signals winter is not far away. From the outside, life appeared unchanged. Madison still went to work. I still went to work. We still lived under the same roof. We still shared meals occasionally. We still exchanged polite conversations. To anyone looking in, we probably seemed like a stable couple entering another ordinary holiday season. The truth was very different. Something inside me had quietly reached its conclusion. Not in anger, not in resentment, in clarity. One afternoon during my lunch break, I sat across from an attorney in a small office overlooking downtown Columbus. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Sunlight reflected off nearby office buildings. Traffic moved steadily below. The attorney reviewed documents while asking practical questions. Assets, accounts, property, timelines. There was nothing dramatic about the meeting. In fact, that was what struck me most. The end of a marriage did not sound like a movie scene. It sounded like paperwork, calm voices, legal terms, signatures. When the meeting ended, I walked back to my truck and sat behind the steering wheel for several minutes. The folder rested on the passenger seat. My hands remained still. Surprisingly, I did not feel devastated. I felt peaceful, the kind of peace that arrives after carrying a question for years and finally accepting the answer. A week later, the documents were ready. I brought them home on a Thursday evening. The same kind of ordinary evening that had once changed everything. The house was quiet. A football game played softly from the living room television. Madison sat at the kitchen island scrolling through her phone. I placed the folder on the counter and took a seat across from her. She glanced up briefly. "What is that?" she asked. Her voice sounded casual, distracted. I looked at her for a moment. For the first time in months, she set her phone down completely. "Something we need to talk about." The room became very still. The refrigerator hummed quietly behind us. Outside, wind rustled dry leaves across the driveway. Madison opened the folder. Her eyes moved across the first page, then the second, then back to the first again. I watched the color slowly drain from her face. "What is this?" she whispered, even though she already knew. I folded my hands together on the countertop. "Divorce papers." The silence that followed felt enormous. Madison stared at me as though she were looking at a stranger. "You are serious?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes." She blinked several times. "Where is this coming from?" The question almost made me smile. Not because it was funny, because the answer had been sitting between us for years. "You already know where it is coming from," I said quietly. Her eyes widened. "Cole, we have been having a rough patch. Every marriage goes through rough patches." I listened without interrupting. Months earlier, those words would have pulled me into another conversation, another attempt, another round of hope. This time they simply floated past me. "A rough patch is temporary," I replied. "This has been our life." Madison looked down at the papers again. Her hands trembled slightly. "I did not think you would actually do this." There it was. The sentence that explained everything. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Surprise. Genuine surprise. Because somewhere along the way she had convinced herself that I would always stay exactly where she left me. I thought about the conversation I overheard. The confidence in her voice. The certainty. Cole will always stay. The memory no longer hurt. It simply confirmed what I already knew. "I know," I said. Madison's eyes filled with emotion. "I did not mean those things." My expression remained calm. Maybe not all at once. I looked at the papers resting between us. Then back at her. "But you meant them every day you treated me that way." The words hung in the air. Neither harsh nor cruel. Just true. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The house felt unusually quiet. The same kitchen. The same countertops. The same marriage that once seemed permanent. Yet everything had changed. Finally, Madison lowered her gaze to the documents and sat motionless. And for the first time since I had known her, she looked like someone who was beginning to understand that some things do not disappear all at once. They disappear one ignored moment at a time until eventually there is nothing left to hold on to. 6 months later, the house looked exactly the same from the street. The same maple tree stood in the front yard. The same white fence bordered the property. The same mailbox waited at the curb. If you drove past slowly, you would never know how much had changed. That seems to be how life works. The biggest transformations are often invisible from the outside. By the time the divorce was finalized, winter had given way to spring. The gray skies of Ohio were slowly turning blue again. New leaves covered branches that had looked lifeless only a few months earlier. There was something symbolic about that. Growth rarely announces itself. It just happens quietly while nobody is paying attention. My new apartment sat 15 minutes from the old neighborhood. It was not larger than the house I left behind. It was not more luxurious, but every inch of it felt peaceful. The furniture was simple. The walls were mostly bare. The kitchen held only the things I actually used. For the first time in years, I was living in a space that reflected who I was instead of who I was trying to be for someone else. The adjustment was easier than I expected. Hard at times, certainly. 18 years cannot disappear overnight. There were moments when old memories surfaced unexpectedly. A song on the radio, a restaurant we used to visit, a photograph tucked inside a forgotten drawer. Those things still carried weight, but they no longer carried power. There is a difference. Weight reminds you where you have been. Power controls where you are going. Around the same time, my relationship with friends grew stronger than it had been in years. Weekend hikes became regular events. Family visits became more frequent. Even work felt different. I was more focused, more energized, more present. The version of myself that had slowly disappeared inside that marriage had started returning. Not all at once, piece by piece. One morning, I caught my reflection in a coffee shop window while walking downtown. For a second, I barely recognized the man staring back. Not because he looked younger, because he looked lighter. The tension that had lived behind my eyes for years was gone. Looking back, I realized something important. The divorce itself was not what changed my life. The change started the moment I stopped accepting a role that diminished my value. Everything that followed simply reflected that decision. As for Madison, I heard updates occasionally through mutual friends. Nothing dramatic, nothing scandalous, just life moving forward the way life always does. I genuinely wished her well. That surprised some people when I said it. They expected anger, resentment, revenge. The truth was simpler. Carrying bitterness only keeps you attached to a chapter that is already over. Letting go is not about forgiving someone else. It is about freeing yourself. The last conversation Madison and I had took place several weeks after everything was finalized. We met briefly to sign a remaining document. The exchange was polite, respectful, quiet. As we stood in the parking lot afterward, she looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something I still think about from time to time. I never thought you would actually leave. The words hung in the spring air between us. Honest, unfiltered, maybe the most honest thing she had said in years. I nodded slowly. I know. There was nothing else to add. Some lessons arrived too late to change the outcome. We said goodbye and walked in opposite directions. I never looked back. Not because I hated her, because I had finally learned to choose myself. If there is one thing this experience taught me, it is that love cannot survive where appreciation disappears. Relationships do not usually collapse because of one terrible moment. They erode through thousands of small moments that tell someone they no longer matter. And eventually, even the most loyal person reaches a point where staying becomes harder than leaving. Today, when I wake up, the future feels open again. Not perfect, not guaranteed, just open. And sometimes that is more than enough. So now I am curious about something. After hearing this story, what would you have done in my position? Would you have stayed and kept trying? Or would you have walked away the moment you realized your value was no longer being seen? Let me know your thoughts in the comments because I genuinely want to hear them. And if stories like this remind you of the importance of self-respect, growth, and knowing when it is time to move forward, consider subscribing and joining us for more journeys that explore the complicated realities of life, relationships, and second chances. Sometimes the hardest endings become the beginning of something far better than we ever imagined.